3 years I'd been out there. 3 years on the prospect, just me and the whales and the grey water stretching to every horizon. The Aleutian coast in winter. Most people wouldn't last 3 weeks. Cold that worked into your bones and stayed there. Wind that never quit. Waves tall enough to make you think real hard about your life choices. I loved it. The isolation suited me fine. Always had. Back at the Oceanic Research Institute's main facility in Anchorage, I'd lasted maybe 6 months before Betty Webster pulled me aside and suggested I might prefer field work. Long-term field work, the kind where you didn't have to sit through staff meetings or make small talk in the break room, or pretend to care about someone's weekend plans. She'd known what she was doing. Betty had that knack for reading people, putting them where they'd actually be useful, instead of where the org chart said they should go. Within a month, I had my assignment. Grey whale migration patterns, full seasonal tracking, comprehensive behavioral study. Within 2 months, I was aboard the Prospect with enough equipment to outfit a small university, and instructions to stay out as long as the data kept coming. The data always kept coming. Grey whales are creatures of habit. That's what makes them perfect for long-term study. They follow routes their ancestors swam when the Bering Sea was a different shape, when humans were still figuring out fire. Every year, same paths, same feeding grounds, same breeding lagoons down in Baja, same summer waters up north. Predictable, reliable. I'd tagged 47 individuals over those 3 years. Each one got a designation code, a tracking beacon embedded just beneath the skin, and a place in my database. The beacons transmitted location, depth, water temperature, movement patterns. Every 6 hours, my system logged their positions, built the maps, tracked the routes. Whale GW Dibuzuthu 3 had been my first, a female, maybe 30 feet long, scarred along her left flank from what looked like an old orca encounter. I'd tagged her in September of year 1, watched her make the full migration south and back twice. 18,000 mi tracked to the quarter mile. Perfect data. GW027 was a juvenile male. Curious as hell, he'd circled the prospect for 2 hours before I could get the tag deployed. Kept surfacing right next to the hull, close enough I could see the barnacle clusters on his rostrum. The way his eye tracked my movements on deck, each whale had a story in the data. Feeding preferences, social behaviors, response to water temperature changes. I knew them better than I'd ever known most people. Zachary thought I was crazy. He crewed the prospect for 3-month rotations, handling the mechanical work and supply runs while I focused on research. Nice kid, maybe 25, from some little fishing town down the coast. He'd asked me once why I bothered learning the individual whales. They're data points, he'd said. You're studying populations, right? Why care about one specific whale? I hadn't been able to explain it in a way that made sense to him. The patterns only emerged when you understood the individuals. Population-level analysis missed too much, smoothed over the variations that actually mattered. You had to know each whale, track each route, log each deviation from expected behavior. That was where the real science lived. In the details, in the exceptions made it worse when they started disappearing. First one was GW32, a mature female I'd tagged 14 months prior, reliable as sunrise. She'd been holding position in a feeding area about 30 miles northwest of my location. Same spot she'd occupied for 6 days running. The kelp beds there were thick, full of the amphipods and ghost shrimp the greys loved. Normal behavior, expected patterns. Then the March 17th morning transmission came through, and she was gone. I was at the monitoring station when it happened. Coffee in one hand, stylus in the other, marking notes on yesterday's movement data. The system logged all transmissions automatically, but I still checked them manually each morning. Old habit, computers miss things. The readout showed 39 active tags, should have been 40. I set down the coffee, scrolled back through the overnight data. GW032's last transmission had come through at 0214 hours. Position logged, depth normal, water temp consistent with the surrounding area. Everything standard. The 0814 transmission was blank, no signal, equipment failure. Had to be. The tags were built to last 5 years minimum, but ocean conditions could be rough on electronics. Pressure changes, saltwater corrosion, maybe a seal had failed, maybe the battery had a defect. Happens sometimes. I pulled up the diagnostic protocols and started running checks. Took me 4 hours to verify every component of the tracking system. The primary receiver functional, operating within normal parameters. The backup receiver, same signal processing array, clean readings, no errors logged. Satellite uplink, strong connection, no dropped packets. I tested the software, checked the database integrity, ran simulations with dummy tags. Everything worked fine. Zachary found me still at it when he came down from the engine room around 1400 hours. Grease on his hands, questions in his eyes. Lost a whale, I said. Dead? Don't know. Signal's gone. He wiped his hands on a rag, leaned over my shoulder to look at the screens. Tag malfunction? Maybe. You don't sound convinced. I wasn't. The tag had been functioning perfectly for 14 months. Battery life should have been good for another 3 years minimum. The last transmission showed no degradation in signal strength, no indication of impending failure. But what else could it be? Whales didn't just vanish. The tags didn't stop working without reason. I logged it as equipment failure and added GW032 to my list of individuals requiring retagging when I could locate her again. Disappointing, losing that continuous data stream, but not catastrophic. 1 tag out of 47. Well within acceptable failure rates, then GW019 disappeared, then GW041, then GW008. All within 8 hours of the first disappearance. I didn't sleep much that second night. Couldn't. I sat at the monitoring station watching the active tag count drop from 46 to 45 to 44 to 43, each loss hitting like a physical thing. These were my whales, my study, 3 years of work, and the data was just stopping. No warnings, no gradual signal degradation, just clean transmissions one cycle, nothing the next. The locations were scattered. GWE19 had been 60 miles south when she dropped offline. GWE41 was east, close to the coast. GW08 was north, in deeper water. No geographical pattern, no connecting factors I could identify. 4 tags failing in 2 days. The probability of that happening by chance was, I ran the numbers twice. 0.3%, effectively impossible. Which meant it wasn't chance. I started the recalibration at 0430 on March 19th. Zachary was still asleep in his bunk. The prospect rocked gently in the pre-dawn darkness, waves slapping against the hull with that steady rhythm I'd stopped noticing years ago. My coffee had gone cold 2 hours back. Every sensor, every receiver, every piece of equipment involved in the tracking system. I pulled diagnostic logs, compared them against baseline readings from installation 3 years prior, checked for drift or degradation. I tested signal frequencies, verified the GPS synchronization, confirmed the satellite link timing, the hydrophone array, perfect, the sonar mapping system functioning normally, the backup tracking computer I kept offline except for data verification. Matched the primary system exactly. Nothing was wrong, but 4 whales were gone from my database and I couldn't explain it. Couldn't accept equipment failure. Not at this rate. Couldn't accept coincidence. I pulled up the raw data files from each disappearance and went through them line by line. Timestamps, position coordinates, depth readings, temperature, salinity, movement vectors. Every last transmission had been clean. Strong signal, full data packet, no errors, and then nothing. I sat back in the chair and stared at the screens. 43 active tags glowed on the map display, scattered across a 100-mile radius of grey ocean. Somewhere out there, 4 whales I'd tracked for months or years were swimming around without my knowledge. Or they were dead. Or they were, I didn't let myself finish that thought. Didn't have room for speculation. Just data. Just facts. The facts said my tracking system was working perfectly. The facts said 4 tags had stopped transmitting without explanation. I rubbed my eyes. The overhead light hummed, that fluorescent buzz that got into your skull if you listened too long. Outside the porthole, the sky was starting to lighten. Another day coming whether I wanted it or not. 43 whales left to track. 43 data points in a study that was supposed to be comprehensive, complete. I'd built 3 years of work on the foundation of continuous, reliable tracking data, on knowing where my whales were, what they were doing, how they moved through their world. Now I didn't know, and I couldn't figure out why. I saved the diagnostic results and backed up the database. Whatever was happening, I needed to document everything, keep the records clean. That was the job. That was always the job. Even when the data stopped making sense, especially then, by Wednesday the count was up to 9. Thursday morning made it 12. Friday evening, 17 whales had gone silent. 17, I sat at the nav station in the Prospect's cramped cabin, the monitor's glow washing everything blue-white in the gathering dusk. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The mug sat there with a film on top, untouched since I'd poured it after breakfast. Outside the porthole, the ocean rolled grey and empty under old concrete. Tag GW173. Last signal Monday 1400 hours. Position 53 degrees north. Tag GW204. Last signal Tuesday 0630. Same position, give or take a nautical mile. Tag GW189. Wednesday 1100 hours. Same coordinates, every single one. Same grid square. Same 200 square mile zone of deep water about 40 miles. Northwest of my position, the Aleutian Trench ran through there. The seafloor dropping off to depths that made your stomach clench just thinking about them. 3,000 meters in some spots, cold and dark and mostly unmapped. I'd pulled up the bathymetric charts, overlaid them with the tracking data. The pattern was unmistakable. Every disappearance clustered in that one area, spread across 6 days, but concentrated in the same stretch of ocean, like someone had drawn a circle on the map and said, "Here, this is where they go." My hand moved across the desk, found the ruler I kept weighted down with a coffee-stained logbook. I measured the zone again, even though I'd done it a dozen times already. Roughly 15 miles across, maybe 13 north to south. Not a migration route, Grey whales followed the coast, stayed in the shallows where the feeding was good. They didn't venture out into the deep water, not this time of year. Not without reason. The prospect creaked around me, hull groaning as a swell passed underneath. I barely heard it. My attention stayed fixed on those coordinates, on the absence they represented. 17 whales don't just vanish. I'd worked marine research for 14 years. Started as a deckhand on survey vessels, worked my way up to assistant researcher, then got my own project 5 years back. I knew equipment failure, knew tag malfunction, knew battery death, knew antenna damage. I'd seen tags go silent because a whale breached wrong and cracked the housing, or because barnacles grew over the sensor array, or because the adhesive failed, and the whole unit just fell off into the ocean. But 17 tags, all in the same location, all within a week. The probability made my teeth hurt. The chair squeaked as I leaned back, pressed my palms against my eye sockets until I saw stars. My shoulders were knots of tension. I'd barely slept since Monday. Just catnaps in the cabin between data checks. Zachary had asked me that morning if I was feeling all right, said I looked like hell. I'd told him I was fine, just focused on the work. That was Tuesday or Wednesday. The days had started bleeding together. I dropped my hands, blinked until the monitor came back into focus. The numbers hadn't changed. Still 17 blank spaces where there should have been data. Still that same grid square, that same impossible pattern. My notebook sat open beside the keyboard, pages covered in my handwriting, coordinates, timestamps, water temperatures, weather conditions. I'd been looking for variables, for some environmental factor that might explain the pattern. Storm activity, negative. Water temperature anomalies, negative. Seismic events, I'd checked the USGS database twice. Found nothing significant. Shipping traffic minimal, just the usual container routes 50 miles south. Nothing explained it. I reached for the satellite phone. The Institute's mainland headquarters kept regular office hours, but Betty Webster usually stayed late on Fridays. Something about quarterly reports and budget reviews. I'd filed my weekly data summary that morning, the routine update on tag status and whale movements. She'd have seen the numbers, would have noticed the gaps in the tracking data, but I needed to talk to her directly. Needed to make her understand this wasn't normal tag failure. The phone took forever to acquire the satellite signal. I stood there in the cabin's narrow space, receiver pressed to my ear, listening to the connection hiss and crackle. Outside, the light was failing, the ocean had gone dark. Just endless black water under a sky that wasn't much lighter. 3 rings 4, then her voice clipped and professional. Webster. Betty. It's Andy. You got a minute? Jimenez. Papers rustled in the background. I saw your weekly report. What's the issue? I glanced at the monitor, at those 17 empty rows, the tags. 17 of them have gone silent in the past 6 days, all in the same location. Silence on the line. Not the thoughtful kind, the impatient kind, the kind that said she was still reading something else while I talked. Betty? I'm here. 17 tags, you said. Yeah, all in the same 200 square mile grid, all within a week. I pulled the notebook closer, read off the coordinates, every single disappearance in that zone. No signals, no error codes, nothing. They just stopped transmitting. More rustling, a drawer opening, closing. And you've verified the receiver equipment? 3 times. The array is functioning normally. I'm getting signals from the other tags without any issues. Battery failure then. How old are these units? My jaw clenched. They're all different ages. Oldest one was deployed 8 months ago. Newest was just 6 weeks. Battery life's rated for 18 months minimum. Rated for, Betty said. Field conditions are different from laboratory conditions. Andy, you know that. Cold water, pressure changes, biological fouling, all of it impacts equipment performance. I stared at the monitor, at the pattern that couldn't be coincidence, not like this. Not 17 units in the same location within 6 days. You're suggesting what, exactly? That something's targeting tagged whales specifically. Her tone had gone flat, dismissive. The tags failed, it happens, or the whales migrated beyond signal range. Grey whales don't migrate through deep water this time of year. They follow the coast, and even if they did, I'd still pick up their signals for at least. Andy, she cut me off clean. I understand you're concerned about the data gaps, but equipment failure is the most logical explanation. Submit a request for replacement tags, and I'll process it Monday. In the meantime, continue monitoring the remaining subjects. My hand tightened on the phone. This isn't equipment failure. Then what is it? I didn't have an answer. That was the problem. I had data, had coordinates, had a pattern that made no sense. But I didn't have an explanation that would satisfy her. Didn't have anything except the cold certainty in my gut that something was wrong. I don't know, I said finally. But 17 whales don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trace. No distress vocalizations. No bodies washing ashore. No evidence of orca predation or net entanglement. I've been monitoring the marine channels, checking with the Coast Guard. Nothing. They're just gone. Betty sighed, the sound sharp with frustration. You're overthinking this. Tag malfunction is a known variable in long-term tracking studies. Yes, 17 in 1 week is higher than average, but it's not impossible. Correlation doesn't imply causation. The location is probably a high-traffic feeding area where the whales are diving deeper, putting more stress on the equipment, or there's some localized interference we haven't identified yet. Electromagnetic anomaly, underwater volcanic activity, any number of factors. Papers shuffled again. Write up your observations. Include them in next week's report. I'll have the engineering team review the tag specifications, but I'm not authorizing an emergency equipment order based on what's most likely a statistical cluster. The conversation was over. I could hear it in her voice, that bureaucratic finality. She'd made her decision, filed my concerns under paranoid field researcher, seeing patterns in random noise. Right, I said. I'll document everything. Good. Was there anything else? 17 whales gone, and she was asking if there was anything else. No, that's it. Then I'll let you get back to work. Have a good weekend, Andy. The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the silence. Outside, the ocean had gone fully dark. No moon, no stars, just the prospect's running lights reflecting off the black water, making it look like we were floating in empty space. I set the phone down, returned to the nav station, to the monitor, still showing those 17 blank rows. Betty was wrong. I knew my equipment, knew these waters, knew that grey whales were creatures of habit, following the same routes their ancestors had followed for thousands of years. They didn't deviate, didn't vanish into deep water without reason, and they sure as hell didn't disappear without leaving evidence. I'd been doing this long enough to know what normal looked like. Predation left bodies, or at least pieces, chunks of blubber and bone washing up on beaches, oil slicks on the surface where scavengers fed. Entanglement in fishing gear meant distress calls, other whales responding, the whole pod getting agitated. Disease showed up in behavior changes days or weeks before death. Animals separating from the group, swimming erratically. This was none of that. This was absolute absence, clean and total, like someone had reached down into the ocean and plucked 17 whales right out of existence. The thought made my skin crawl. I pulled up the acoustic monitoring logs, the recordings from the hydrophone array I'd deployed throughout the region. Hours of audio data, whale songs and ocean noise compressed into spectrograms. I scrolled back through the week, checking the timestamps that corresponded with each tag failure. Nothing unusual, normal vocalizations, normal ambient sound, then silence where a whale should have been, but no indication of why. No alarm calls, no sounds of struggle, just the ocean, continuing on without them. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the desk, forced myself to breathe slowly. 14 years I'd been studying these animals. 14 years of data collection, of pattern recognition, of learning to read the ocean's rhythms. I knew when something was wrong, knew it the same way you know when you're being watched in an empty room. That animal awareness that lives deeper than rational thought. Something terrible was happening beneath the surface, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. The dive checklist sat on the galley table, laminated and coffee-stained from 3 years of routine equipment inspections. I'd made it myself that first winter back when everything still followed proper procedure. 27 items, each one critical for safe operation. I'd checked them all 100 times before. Never for this. The gear lay spread across every surface in the cabin. Dry suit, regulator, tank, buoyancy compensator, weight belt, dive computer strapped to my wrist. Its display cycling through depth limits and decompression schedules I'd memorized years ago but never actually used out here. Research vessels weren't supposed to need diving equipment. We had ROVs for seafloor investigation, remote cameras, sonar arrays, clean data collection from the safety of the deck. But the ROV had been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. Budget cuts meant replacement parts came quarterly now, not on demand. And whatever was down there at 600 feet, whatever had been sitting motionless on the seafloor since Tuesday, when I had first caught it on sonar, it wasn't going to identify itself through a computer screen. I ran my fingers along the dry suit seals, checking for any degradation in the rubber. 3 years in salt air did damage. Everything corroded eventually out here. You're really doing this? Zachary's voice came from the cabin doorway, a flat statement rather than a question. I need to see it. The ROV will be back online next week. Betty said the parts shipped yesterday. I didn't look up from the equipment. Something's killing the whales, 17 of them. Zachary, 17 in less than a week. And you think diving 600 feet solo is going to tell you what? I think there's something down there. Something big enough to register on sonar, but not moving, not breathing, not alive in any way. The instruments recognized silence. Then the creak of floorboards as he came inside, closing the door against the wind. February on the Aleutian coast. The kind of cold that made your teeth ache. He picked up the regulator, turned it over in his scarred hands. When's the last time you dove? Certification was 6 years ago. Refresher course 4 years back. In what? A heated pool in Seattle? Monterey Bay, 50 degrees water. This is 34 degrees. You got 40 minutes max before the cold gets into your core, even with the suit. He set the regulator down, careful despite the criticism. And that's in shallow water. 600 feet, you're looking at nitrogen narcosis, pressure effects, limited bottom time. I know the risks. Do you? He pulled out the chair across from me, sat down heavy. Because I've worked these waters 30 years, seen plenty of smart men do stupid things, usually works out about how you'd expect. I started assembling the buoyancy compensator, threading straps through buckles with muscle memory I didn't know I still had. The mechanical precision of it felt good. Concrete steps, verifiable results. The sonar doesn't lie, I said. There's something down there roughly the size of a small house. Hasn't moved in 3 days. Lots of things could cause that reading. Rock formation, old shipwreck, volcanic debris. I've mapped that section of seafloor twice. Nothing was there before. Zachary was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, more careful. There's stories, old ones. Fishermen don't talk about them much anymore, especially not around scientists. But 30 years ago, when I was starting out, the old-timers used to mention certain coordinates. Places they wouldn't set nets, wouldn't even run their boats through, not if they could help it. I looked up. His pale blue eyes were steady on mine. Dead zones, they called them. Not dead like no oxygen. Dead like. He paused, choosing words, like the ocean itself was holding its breath. Fish wouldn't swim there, birds wouldn't fly over. And instruments, compasses, depth finders, radios, they'd all go strange, not broken exactly, just wrong. Despite myself, I felt something cold move down my spine. Magnetic anomalies. Underwater topography affecting. I know what you're going to say. Got rational explanations for all of it, I'm sure. He leaned back, the chair creaking. But I've also seen things out here that don't fit in your databases. Water that don't move right. Sounds that come from too deep. That feeling you get sometimes at night when everything goes quiet and the ocean feels like it's waiting for something. The cabin's heater clicked on, blowing stale air across my neck. Outside, I could hear the Prospect's hull creaking against the anchor chain. Normal sounds, explainable sounds. Where exactly did these dead zones supposedly exist? Zachary reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded chart. Old paper, not the digital displays I used. He spread it on the table, pushing my gear aside, and tapped a spot with one thick finger. Our current coordinates, give or take half a mile. My throat went dry. That's coincidence, maybe. He refolded the chart, slow and deliberate. Or maybe those old sailors knew something about reading the ocean that don't fit in your equipment manuals. I turned back to the dive computer, pulling up the depth profile. 600 feet, technical diving range. Decompression required. Margin for error slim to non-existent in these conditions. Every protocol I'd established said, don't do this, wait for the ROV, wait for proper support, wait for backup. This was how people died. Solo dives in deep water, driven by obsession rather than procedure. But 17 whales had gone silent. 17 animals that had been alive and singing, reduced to nothing but absence in my data. And whatever had done it was still down there, still waiting. I needed to know. Help me check the seals, I said. Zachary didn't move for a long moment. Then he sighed, deep and resigned, and reached for the equipment checklist. Tank pressure 3000 psi, topped it off this morning. Regulator function. I demonstrated, the hiss of compressed air sharp in the cabin's quiet. Clear. We went through all 27 items. He knew the procedure as well as I did, even though he'd never used this particular equipment. 30 years on boats taught you to respect the machinery that kept you alive. Dive computer programmed for decompression stops. Automatically calculated ascent rate locked to 30 feet per minute. And if something goes wrong, if you get tangled or the current shifts, emergency ascent procedures. Drop the weights, controlled breathing, monitor for embolism symptoms. I met his eyes. I've done this before, Zachary. Not here, not in these conditions, but I know what I'm doing. Knowing what you're doing and doing it safe are different things. But he handed me the checklist. Everything verified. How long you planning to stay down? 10 minutes at depth, maybe 15 if the conditions allow. Just long enough to get visual confirmation and take samples. Samples of what? Whatever's down there. He stood, walked to the cabin's small window. Outside, the afternoon light was already fading. February this far north meant maybe 6 hours of weak daylight. We were losing even that. Currents running southeast, he said. 2 knots, maybe 3. Visibility will be poor once you get below 100 feet. I have lights. Lights don't help if you can't tell up from down. He turned back. I'm telling you, this is a bad idea. Not just dangerous, bad, wrong. Whatever word makes you understand. I think you shouldn't do this. The thing was, I agreed with him. Every rational part of my brain was screaming the same message. But rationality hadn't explained the whales, hadn't explained the sonar contact, hadn't explained why the water temperature had dropped 3 degrees in 4 days, or why the hydrophones kept picking up that low-frequency pulse that didn't match any known source. Something was happening beneath the surface, Something my instruments could measure but not identify. I needed to see it with my own eyes. "I'm going," I said. Zachary nodded like he'd known that was the answer all along. "Then I'll watch the line. You get in trouble. You tug 3 times fast. I'll pull you up regardless of decompression. That could kill me. So could staying down there." I suited up on deck, the wind cutting through my thermal layers until I got the dry suit sealed. Heavy, restrictive. The weight belt pulled at my hips. Tank straps dug into my shoulders. This was the part they never showed in the recruitment videos. The sheer physical discomfort of fieldwork. The way your body became just another piece of equipment to maintain and monitor. Zachary checked my seals one more time, his hands quick and professional despite the cold. "Computer's running?" I glanced at my wrist. Depth reading 0, timer ready, tissue saturation nominal, active. "You've got 60 minutes of air. That's your hard limit. Anything goes weird, anything at all, you abort. Clear?" "Clear." The descent line was already rigged, tied off to the stern cleat, and waited to hang straight down into the darkness. I'd drop along it, use it to control my rate, follow it back up for decompression stops. Simple, clean, assuming the current didn't shift or the line didn't tangle or any of 100 other variables didn't complicate things. I sat on the gunwale, regulator in my mouth, fins dangling over black water. The prospect rose and fell with the swell. Gentle motion that would feel violent once I was submerged. Timing the entry mattered. Zachary's hand on my shoulder, firm pressure through the dry suit. When I looked up, his weathered face was set in grim lines. "Don't die down there," he said. I'm too old to explain it to Betty. I wanted to say something reassuring, give him data about safety margins and training protocols. But my mouth was full of rubber and the moment was passing, and sometimes there weren't words for what needed saying. I rolled backward into the ocean, the cold hit even through the dry suit, the shock of it driving the air from my lungs. Surface turbulence spun me, disorienting, until I grabbed the descent line and oriented myself. Sky above, darkness below, the prospect's hull a pale shadow through churning water. Zachary's face appeared over the rail, watching. I raised one hand, signaled OK, and began to descend. The light failed fast. 20 feet down and the sun was already a memory, just diffuse grayness filtering through infinite water. 40 feet and I needed the helmet light, switching it on to see the descent line in front of my mask. 60 feet and there was nothing but what the beam revealed. Particles suspended in the water column, the white rope disappearing into blackness below. My computer beeped softly, monitoring depth and nitrogen absorption, ears popping as pressure built. I equalized, kept descending, watching the numbers climb, 100 feet, 150, 200. The world had contracted to just the light and the line and the sound of my own breathing, loud and mechanical in the regulator, in, out, in, out. Each breath measured in PSI depleting from the tank. Nothing else existed, just the descent, just the darkness pressing in from all sides, 300 feet. Halfway there, I paused, checked the computer, nitrogen levels acceptable, air consumption within normal parameters, temperature dropping, 33 degrees now. Cold enough that my fingers were starting to go numb despite the gloves. Below me, nothing but black. I kept going 0 feet. The water went from dark to darker. Not gradually, there was a threshold, a line I crossed, where the last traces of surface light just quit. Cold hit me through the dry suit, through the thermal layers, straight into my chest. The kind of cold that's got nothing to do with temperature readings, and everything to do with being somewhere you don't belong. My dive lights carved out 2 weak cones in the murk. Particulate matter drifted through the beams. Organic snow falling in slow motion. Plankton, detritus, the ocean's debris field. I could see maybe 15 feet ahead. Beyond that, nothing but black pressing in from every direction. The depth gauge on my wrist read 412 feet. Nitrogen narcosis territory for most recreational divers. Jacques Cousteau called it rapture of the deep, that dreamy, drunk feeling that made people do stupid things at depth, pull out their regulators, swim deeper instead of up. I'd done enough technical dives to recognize the early signs, tunnel vision, slowed thinking, the sense that everything was just fine when it absolutely wasn't. I checked my gas mixture. Trimix was flowing clean, the helium keeping my head clearer than it had any right to be this far down. Consumption rate still normal. I'd planned for 800 feet with enough reserve to get back up if things went wrong. The if was starting to feel optimistic. My breathing echoed in my ears. In, out, the regulator's mechanical rhythm. I focused on keeping it steady, controlled. Panic burned through gas faster than anything, and I couldn't afford to waste a single breath. The descent line stretched below me into nothing. I'd tied it off to the Prospect's stern cleat topside, my only guaranteed route back. Losing it down here would be a death sentence. The current wasn't strong, but it was present enough to push me off course if I wasn't careful. I kept one hand on the line and kept going 500 feet, 550, 600. The pressure built with every foot, not painful exactly, more like the ocean was squeezing me from all sides, testing to see what I was made of. My dry suit compressed tighter against my body. I added air to the bladder, equalizing, keeping the squeeze from turning dangerous. My ears popped again. The Valsalva maneuver had become automatic. Pinch, blow, clear, over and over. Miss it once at this depth, and I'd rupture an eardrum, maybe worse. The darkness felt solid, dense. I couldn't shake the impression that I was descending through something thicker than water, something that resisted my presence. Stupid thought. Nitrogen narcosis creeping in despite the trimix. I noted it, filed it away, kept my attention on the basics. Depth, gas, time, the fundamentals that kept you alive when your brain started playing tricks. My light beams trembled. Took me a second to realize my hands were shaking. Cold. Just the cold 0.62 feet. The depth gauge numbers glowed green in the darkness. Deepest I'd ever gone was 7:15 off the coast of Monterey, inspecting a kelp forest die-off. That dive had been planned for months, with a full support team topside and a decompression chamber standing by. This was just me. The descent line angled slightly as the current pushed it. I followed it down hand over hand, my fins moving in slow scissor kicks to control my rate. Too fast and I'd overshoot, waste gas correcting. Too slow and I'd burn through my bottom time before I saw anything useful. Had to be precise. Had to stay. The seafloor materialized beneath me. My stomach lurched, not from the depth, not from narcosis or the pressure or the cold that had worked its way into my bones. From what my lights revealed. Bones. Everywhere. White against the dark sediment. Stark and clean and wrong. Whale bones. I hung there on the descent line, 10 feet above the bottom, and tried to make my brain process what I was seeing. The beam from my primary light swept across ribs the size of support beams. A skull, grey whale, had to be, I knew the shape, resting on its side with the jaw articulated open. Vertebrae scattered in a line like train cars derailed across the basin floor. Another skeleton 5 yards to the left, and another beyond that my regulator hissed, in, out. I couldn't seem to get enough air. I'd expected maybe 1 carcass, 2 at most. A natural die-off. Some localized event that had killed a couple whales and sent them to the bottom. Explainable, documentable, the kind of thing that happened in nature. Tragic, but understandable. This wasn't that. I descended the last 10 feet and my fins touched bottom. Sediment puffed up in slow clouds. The impact sent a tremor through my legs. Or maybe I was just shaking harder now. Dozens of them. Dozens of whale skeletons spread across the seafloor in every direction my lights could reach. I started counting. Had to. It's what I did. Collect data, quantify observations, turn the incomprehensible into numbers that could be analyzed. My brain needed the structure, needed something to hold on to while it tried to make sense of the graveyard stretching out before me. 1. Grey whale, approximately 40 feet long, skeleton fully articulated, lying on its right side, bones completely clean, no tissue, no blubber, nothing but bare white calcium carbonate. 2. Humpback, smaller. Maybe a juvenile, 30 feet, ribs splayed outward, skull detached and resting 3 feet from the cervical vertebrae. 3. Another grey, 45 feet, full adult. Perfect skeleton like something you'd see in a museum display. My light swept left. 4. 5. 6. I moved forward, following the descent line as it snaked across the basin floor. My fins stirred up more sediment. The visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet, didn't matter. Everywhere I pointed my light, more bones. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Humpbacks and greys mostly, but I spotted what looked like a fin whale too. Massive thing, had to be 60 feet long. Its skeleton stretched across the seafloor in an almost perfect line. Every bone in place. 12. 13. My breathing was coming faster. I forced it back under control. Hyperventilating at 600 feet would put me on the fast track to a CO2 buildup, and that was a problem I didn't need on top of everything else going wrong. 14. 15. The scale of it hit me in waves. This wasn't recent. Couldn't be. It took months, maybe years, for a whale carcass to be stripped this clean. Whale falls were supposed to sustain entire ecosystems. Hagfish and sleeper sharks and bone-eating worms, whole communities that fed on the remains for decades. But these bones were bare, pristine, not a scrap of tissue remaining, not a single organism visible on the surfaces. 16. 17. 18. My mind struggled with the math. 17 whales had gone silent over the past week. 17. I was looking at more than that right now, and my lights only reached 15 feet in any direction. How many more were out there in the darkness? How long had this been happening? 3 years I'd been monitoring this population. 3 years of clean data, normal patterns, healthy vocalizations. How had I missed this? 19, 20, 21. I kept counting because I didn't know what else to do. 22 was a calf. Couldn't have been more than 20 feet. The bones looked fragile, delicate. Wrong. 23, 24. My light caught something that made me stop. The pattern. I'd been so focused on individual skeletons, on counting and cataloging, that I hadn't stepped back, hadn't looked at the whole picture. I turned slowly, playing my light in a wide arc across the seafloor. The skeletons weren't random, weren't scattered by current or chance. They formed a spiral. A perfect, deliberate spiral curving inward from the edges of the basin toward a central point. maybe 30 yards ahead. Each carcass positioned with methodical precision, the spacing between them almost uniform, ribs aligned, skulls oriented inward toward the center. My hand found the ascent line without conscious thought, gripped it hard enough that my fingers cramped inside the thick gloves. This wasn't a die-off. This wasn't natural mortality or disease, or any explanation that fit inside the framework of marine biology. Something had arranged these bodies. Something had been feeding here. Not in the chaotic, opportunistic way that scavengers fed, but with intention, with organization, with intelligence. The cold wasn't coming from the water anymore. It was rising from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside my chest where the rational part of my brain was screaming that I needed to leave now, immediately. But I couldn't move. I stood there on the seafloor, 600 feet below the surface, my dive light illuminating a graveyard that shouldn't exist, arranged in a pattern that couldn't be natural, and all I could think was, what does this to whales? What kills them, strips them clean, and arranges their bones in spirals on the ocean floor? My breathing echoed in my ears. In, out, in, out. The darkness pressed closer. I reached for the ascent line with both hands, ready to pull myself up, to get out of this place and back to the surface where things made sense. But I couldn't stop staring at the spiral, at the terrible precision of it. At the center point where all those skulls were facing, like they were watching something, waiting for something. My light didn't reach that far. I didn't want it to. The depth gauge caught my attention first. Just a flicker in my peripheral vision. Numbers shifting faster than they should. I'd been at 430 feet for maybe 2 minutes, hovering above that circle of skulls, trying to keep my breathing steady and my light trained on the sediment below. The readout jumped. 450 feet, 470, 500. I hadn't moved, hadn't adjusted my buoyancy, hadn't felt any pull downward. The regulator hissed its steady rhythm in my ears. In, out. Bubbles streaming upward in a column I could see when I tilted my head. Same rhythm I'd maintained since leaving the surface. 550 feet, 600. My chest went tight. I checked my surroundings. Same darkness, same faint glow of my headlamp cutting through the murk. Same pale shapes scattered across the seafloor below. The rope from the surface still hung beside me, taut and vertical, disappearing up into the black. I hadn't drifted. The pressure in my ears hadn't changed. Everything felt identical to 30 seconds ago. 700 feet. I tapped the gauge housing with one gloved finger. Sometimes condensation got in, threw off the sensors. 3 years on the prospect had taught me which equipment quirks meant danger and which just meant maintenance. A sticky readout was annoying, not fatal. The numbers kept climbing. 800 feet, 900, 1,000. Jesus. The word came out in a burst of bubbles. I grabbed the dive computer strapped to my other wrist, checked the backup depth reading there. 432 feet, steady, exactly where I should be. The primary gauge hit were 200 feet. I stared at it. The digital display was crisp. No flickering, no obvious malfunction, just numbers that made no goddamn sense. Climbing past WIT 300, WIT 400. My actual depth hadn't changed. I could feel it in my body, in the pressure against my skull, in the way my lungs worked against the compressed air. This wasn't nitrogen narcosis. This wasn't equipment failure. FEF 500 feet, FEF 600, the readout was smooth, clinical, each number ticking upward with the same precision I'd relied on for 3 years of research dives. No hesitation, no errors, just data that violated every physical law I understood. Full 800 feet. I should have started ascending right then, should have followed protocol. Malfunctioning equipment means abort the dive, return to surface, no exceptions. That's what the manual said. That's what I'd told Zachary 100 times when he got impatient with safety procedures. Wafting 900 feet, my hand stayed on the gauge, watching, just watching. Because some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years tracking patterns in whale songs, the part that had catalogued 17 silent animals and found a circle of skulls arranged with impossible precision, that part wanted to see what happened when the numbers hit 2,000, 1,950 feet, 1,975. The gauge held there, just held, like it had reached some predetermined limit. 2,000 feet, displayed with perfect digital clarity while I floated at 432 feet actual depth. My backup computer showing no change, my body feeling no difference. Then the water moved. Not current. I'd felt current before. The push and pull of tides, the sweep of deep ocean circulation. This was something else, thickness. Like the water itself was gaining density, pressing against my dry suit from all sides with force that shouldn't exist. I tried to lift my arm. The movement came slow, sluggish, not the normal resistance of moving through water at depth. This was viscosity, like I'd suddenly dropped into cold syrup. My breath came harder. The regulator delivered air fine, but drawing it into my lungs took effort that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. The pressure against my chest increased. I checked the backup computer again. 432 feet, same depth. But my ears were starting to ache with pressure that felt wrong, felt deeper. My sinuses throbbed. The dry suit squeezed tighter against my ribs despite the inflation valve showing proper air volume. I tried kicking upward. My fins moved through the thickened water like I was pushing through wet concrete. Each stroke took twice the effort for half the distance. The rope beside me still hung vertical and true, but when I reached for it, my arm moved in slow motion, fighting resistance that made my shoulder burn. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. The water didn't just change density. Pressure didn't spike without depth change. I was still at 432 feet. The backup computer confirmed it. The rope confirmed it. My own eyes could see I hadn't moved, but my body was experiencing something else entirely. Something the instruments couldn't measure or the physics couldn't explain. The thickness pressed harder. I managed to grab the rope. The line felt solid under my glove, real and present and normal. I started pulling myself upward, hand over hand, fighting the viscosity that wanted to hold me in place. My lungs worked harder with each breath. The regulator hissed louder. Or maybe that was just my own desperation making it seem that way. 0.5 feet up the rope. 10 feet. The backup computer ticked down 428 feet, 424. But the primary gauge still read 2000 and the water kept pressing. My chest ached, not from the air. The tank pressure was fine. I'd checked it 30 seconds ago. This was something else. This was the feeling of being watched, of being noticed. That same animal awareness that had hit me on the surface when the whales went silent. That primitive certainty that lives in the brain stem below conscious thought. Something was wrong with the space around me. I stopped climbing. Just stopped, my hands frozen on the rope, my body hanging suspended in water that felt too thick, too heavy, too aware. That's when I felt it. Not saw it, felt it. Displacement. Like standing on a beach and feeling the water pull back before a wave hits. Like the air pressure dropping before a storm. The ocean around me moved. Not with current, not with my own motion, but with the presence of something massive changing the space it occupied. The water bent. That's the only way I can describe it. The water bent around something so vast that its mere existence warped the physics of everything nearby. I could feel the pressure differential, the way the ocean had to make room for mass on a scale I couldn't comprehend. My headlamp beam didn't reach far. Maybe 20 feet in this murk, 30 if I was lucky. But I didn't need to see. I could feel it coming. Every nerve in my body went electric. My heart slammed against my ribs hard enough that I could hear my pulse in my ears, competing with the hiss of the regulator. My hands locked on the rope. My legs stopped kicking. I hung there in the thickened water, motionless, except for the stream of bubbles still rising from my exhalations, and felt something enormous moving through the darkness below me. Not swimming, moving. There's a difference. Swimming is active, muscles working, water displaced in rhythmic patterns. This was presence shifting position. This was mass so large that its movement changed everything around it without effort, without sound, without warning except the terrible certainty in my gut that I was no longer alone. The pressure increased. My ears screamed. My sinuses felt like they'd burst. The dry suit compressed tighter despite the physics that said it shouldn't. That said I was still at 420 feet according to the backup computer. That said this wasn't possible. But it was happening. I could feel it approaching. Not fast, not slow, just inevitable, like gravity, like the tide, like something that didn't need to hurry because there was nowhere for me to go. The displacement grew stronger. That sense of massive presence bending the ocean around itself, making space, demanding space, taking space that belonged to the water and the darkness and me. My breath came in short gasps now. The regulator hissed faster. I was burning through air, I knew it, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. My body had taken over, flooding my system with adrenaline that did nothing except make my heart pound harder, and my lungs work faster, and my hands shake on the rope. The thing moved closer. I couldn't see it. My headlamp showed nothing but darkness, and suspended sediment, and the faint glow of my own bubbles rising. But I didn't need to see it. I could feel the displacement, feel the pressure of its passage, feel the water thickening even more as something vast moved through the abyss toward my exact position. It knew I was here. That certainty hit me with the force of physical impact. This wasn't random, wasn't coincidence. Whatever moved through the darkness below, it was aware of me, had noticed me, was approaching with purpose I couldn't begin to understand. My hands stayed frozen on the rope. My legs hung useless below me. I should have been climbing, should have been ascending fast as I dared without risking the bends, should have been halfway to the surface by now. Safety stop be damned. But I couldn't move. The thing kept coming, the pressure kept building, and I hung there in water that felt thick as oil, my malfunctioning depth gauge still reading 2,000 feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, understanding with horrifying clarity that I was no longer alone in this abyss. Something vast moved through the darkness below, and it was coming for me. The light caught it first, just a flash of something pale moving through the murk beyond my beam's reach. There and gone before my brain could process what I'd seen. Then it came again, closer this time, sliding through the water with a smoothness that didn't belong to anything I'd ever documented. Segmented, that was the word that hit me. Like a spine the size of a shipping container. Vertebrae the color of old bone drifting past in sections that moved independently of each other. The movement had a rhythm to it, slow, certain, the way a shark cruises through familiar territory, conserving energy because nothing in its world requires haste. I didn't move, couldn't. My hand stayed locked on the camera housing, fingers cramped around plastic that suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper. The regulator in my mouth pulled with each breath, too fast, way too fast. I was burning through my air supply, but I couldn't slow it down. The thing curved through my light's periphery again. Closer still, I caught more detail this time. Texture that made my throat close up. The segments weren't bone, not exactly. Something between cartilage and calcified tissue, ridged and pitted with age, covered in growths I couldn't identify. Barnacles maybe, or something that served the same purpose down here, where sunlight had never reached. How long? The thought came fragmented, barely coherent. How long has this thing been down here? The creature's body, because I understood now that I was seeing pieces of a single massive organism, not multiple animals, moved with hydraulic precision. Each segment flexed and contracted in sequence, propelling it through the water column with almost no displacement. Efficient, evolved for this exact environment over timescales I couldn't begin to calculate. My depth gauge read 470 feet. I'd drifted down another 40 feet while my brain had been locked in that primal freeze response. The circle of skulls was somewhere below me now, invisible in the black. And this thing was circling, hunting patterns. I'd documented them in orcas, in sharks, in every apex predator the Institute had ever funded research on. I knew what I was seeing. The pale body slid past again, maybe 10 feet away. This time close enough that I caught the wake, felt the pressure change push against my suit. My light traveled along its length, 20 feet of visible body, maybe more beyond the beam's reach. No end to it that I could see, just that slow undulation, disappearing into darkness on both sides. Then it turned. The head came around with that same terrible slowness, and my light caught the front of it square on. No eyes, nothing that looked like sensory organs at all. Just smooth, pale tissue stretched over a skull structure that tapered to a blunt point. The mouth. Christ, the mouth. It ran nearly the entire length of what I could see. Not a jaw that opened and closed. A gullet. A feeding tube lined with rows of teeth that curved backward, translucent and needle-thin. Hundreds of them, arranged in spiraling patterns that led down into a throat wide enough to swallow me whole. Wide enough to swallow a whale calf whole. The thought arrived with crystalline clarity, cutting through the panic. This was what had taken them. Not a pod of orcas. Not a new human threat I'd failed to document. This thing, sliding through the deep trenches where my hydrophones couldn't track it, rising to feed when opportunity presented itself. 17 whales, the creature drifted closer. I still couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked down. Some evolutionary override that predated conscious thought. Prey response. The absolute stillness that small animals adopt when a predator passes nearby. That last desperate gamble that maybe, you won't be noticed. It brushed against me. Just the lightest contact. The side of its body sliding past my shoulder, my tank, my right leg. The texture registered through the dry suit. Smooth and cold and utterly alien. Skin that felt too thick, too tough, designed to withstand pressures that would crush a human body into pulp. The thing was testing me. I understood that with the same clarity that had brought the realization about the whales. The way it moved, the deliberate contact. It was deciding, measuring this small, warm thing that had invaded its territory, that hung suspended in the water column, radiating body heat and electrical impulses and all the other signatures that marked me as living tissue. Worth eating? Worth the energy expenditure? My air consumption had to be critical by now. I couldn't check the gauge, couldn't move my eyes from the creature, couldn't risk even that small motion. The regulator kept pulling, mechanical and steady, each breath a betrayal, announcing my presence to anything with the senses to detect it. The gullet passed inches from my mask. I saw down into it, past those spiraling rows of teeth, into the throat beyond. Bioluminescence flickered somewhere deep inside. Faint blue-green pulses that might have been digestive organs or lures or something I had no framework to understand. The smell hit me through the regulator, through the salt water. Impossible, but undeniable. Decay. Deep ocean. Rot. The stench of things dead so long that decomposition itself had evolved into something different. Time stopped meaning anything. Seconds or minutes, I couldn't tell. The creature filled my entire sensory world. Pale, segmented body curving through the darkness. That eyeless head sweeping back and forth with methodical precision. The mouth never closing, because why would it need to close down here where everything was food, or would be eventually? Ancient. The words surfaced through my terror. This thing was old in ways I couldn't quantify. Not just individual age, evolutionary age. A body plan that had worked for so long that change became unnecessary. Perfect adaptation to an environment that never shifted, never challenged, never demanded anything except patience. The whales hadn't stood a chance. Fast swimmers, intelligent, equipped with echolocation, sophisticated enough to map the ocean floor in real time. None of it mattered against something that hunted by patience, by waiting in the deep places until prey wandered close enough, then rising with that slow, terrible certainty to feed. My chest ached, lungs pulling hard against the regulator, trying to draw air that felt thinner with each breath. The nitrogen narcosis was getting worse. Had to be, because the edges of my vision were starting to sparkle. Thoughts coming loose from their moorings, the creature completed its pass. The tail section, or what I assumed was the tail, brushed past my left side, and then it was beyond me, sliding away into the murk with that same unhurried rhythm. The bioluminescence inside its body pulsed once, twice, fading to nothing as the distance increased. It had decided I wasn't worth it. Too small, wrong texture. Something in my composition that marked me as unsuitable prey. I hung there in the darkness, 470 feet down, understanding with absolute certainty what I just survived. The architect of the spiral graveyard below. The reason my tracking system had gone quiet, the answer to every question I'd been asking for 2 weeks. And I couldn't move, couldn't think, beyond the primal terror still flooding every nerve in my body. Couldn't do anything except watch the pale shape disappear into the black and know that it was still down there, waiting. Patient, eternal, the regulator hissed in my ear. Not the normal rhythm of compressed air flowing through the system. This was different, higher-pitched, desperate, empty. I sucked hard, trying to pull oxygen from the mouthpiece. Nothing came, just resistance. Just that terrible hollow feeling of drawing on nothing at all. My hand went to the tank gauge. Training, muscle memory. The automatic response drilled into me through 100 dives. The needle sat steady at half full. Plenty of air. Enough for another 20 minutes at this depth. Enough to ascend safely with stops for decompression. But nothing reached my lungs. I worked the regulator, checking the purge valve, tapped the gauge. The needle didn't move. Everything read normal. Everything said I should be breathing just fine. My chest started to tighten. I switched to the backup regulator, fingers clumsy with the cold and the first edge of panic. Bit down on the mouthpiece, sucked hard. Nothing, the equipment wasn't failing. That was the thought that cut through everything else. Sharp and cold as the water pressing in around me. The gauges were fine. The regulators were fine. The tank was half full of compressed air that should be flooding my lungs with every breath. But something down here didn't want me breathing. My vision started to narrow at the edges. Not darkness exactly, more like tunnel vision. Everything going tight and focused. The pale shape had disappeared back into the black below. The circle of skulls sat undisturbed on the sediment. My headlamp beam cut through the murk, showing nothing but particles drifting in the current. I needed to surface, needed air, needed to get out of this water before the oxygen deprivation dragged me under for good. I kicked upward, hard, desperate, every muscle in my legs driving me toward the surface that sat somewhere above in the absolute dark. The safety stop protocols, the decompression requirements, the careful ascent rate, all of it went straight out of my head. Survival instinct took over. That animal brain that doesn't care about the bends or nitrogen narcosis or anything except the next breath. My lungs burned. Actually burned. This acid fire spreading through my chest as the last of my oxygen got used up. I kept kicking. Couldn't see anything above me. The headlamp just showed water. Endless water. No light from the surface penetrating this deep. 300 feet. Had to be around 300 feet still, maybe more. The burning in my chest got worse. My vision narrowed further, going spotty at the edges, black creeping in where there should have been light. My legs kept moving, but they felt distant, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. I looked down once. Couldn't help it. Some part of me needed to know if it was following. The pale shape hung in the water below me, not pursuing, not rushing up to drag me back down into the feeding ground. Just watching. Patient, unhurried, the way a fisherman watches a hooked salmon run out the line, knowing it'll tire eventually, knowing it's already caught. That's what I was seeing in whatever passed for its attention. Confidence, the absolute certainty that all prey eventually returned to its feeding ground, that I could flee to the surface, could gasp air, could run as far as I wanted. I'd come back. They always came back. My vision went darker. The headlamp beam seemed dimmer. Or maybe that was just my eyes failing. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything except the fire in my lungs, and the cold pressing in, and the terrible knowledge that I was drowning in the middle of the ocean, with half a tank of air strapped to my back. I kept swimming. Didn't have a choice. The animal brain doesn't quit just because the situation's hopeless. It keeps fighting right up until the end. Keeps clawing for one more second, one more chance. My arms moved through the water. My legs kicked. The regulator hung useless in my mouth. The darkness pressed in from all sides. Not just the absence of light. This was something heavier, something with weight and presence. The same wrongness I'd felt looking at those skulls, at that spiral pattern, at the pale shape sliding through the black. This water didn't want me here. I was trespassing in a place where humans didn't belong, where our equipment and our science and our rational understanding meant nothing at all. My consciousness started to slip, fragments of thought breaking apart, losing coherence. The data. Had to document the data. The whales, 17 whales, the spiral, the skulls, the pale shape with its terrible patience. Had to tell someone. Had to. Air hit my face. I broke the surface, gasping, choking, sucking oxygen into lungs that felt like they'd been scrubbed with steel wool. Salt water in my mouth, in my nose, waves slapping against my mask. Grey sky overhead, heavy with clouds. I ripped the regulator out, spat seawater, gulped air that tasted like the best thing I'd ever experienced. My whole body shook, couldn't stop shaking. The cold had worked all the way through the dry suit, through the thermal layers. Straight into my core I spun in the water, looking for the prospect. Nothing. Just ocean. Grey water stretching to every horizon, low swells rolling past. The sky pressing down heavy and close. The boat should have been right here. I'd descended from the prospect's position. Should have surfaced within sight of it. Maybe 100 yards off if the current had pushed me. But there was nothing. No vessel, no landmark. Just me alone in the middle of the Bering Sea with no memory of how I'd gotten here. I tried to think back, tried to trace the path from the moment I'd started ascending. The panic, the burning lungs, the pale shape watching from below. Everything after that was blank. Not forgotten exactly. More like it had never registered in the first place. 3 miles. That's what they told me later. 3 miles from where the prospect sat, anchored, from where Zachary waited on deck. 3 miles I'd traveled with no air in my lungs and no conscious memory of swimming. I treaded water, still shaking, my thoughts starting to fragment again. Hypothermia. Had to be hypothermia setting in. The dry suit kept the water off my skin, but it didn't generate heat. I'd been down there too long, been too deep, burned too much energy in the panic ascent. My lips felt numb. My fingers wouldn't respond right when I tried to work the inflator on my BCDA. Sound cut through the wave noise. Mechanical, rhythmic, helicopter. I turned my head, movement sluggish. An orange and white Coast Guard helo came in low over the water, searchlight sweeping across the swells behind it, maybe half a mile out. A cutter pushed through the chop, Zachary. Had to be Zachary who'd called it in. Old bastard must have realized something had gone wrong when I didn't surface. Must have hit the emergency beacon, got the Coast Guard moving, the searchlight found me, pinned me in white brilliance that made me squint after so long in the dark. The helicopter circled, and I saw the cutter changing course, coming straight for my position. I tried to wave, managed to lift one arm. Everything felt distant again, disconnected. The cold working deeper, shutting down the systems one by one. The cutter came alongside. Professional, efficient people moving on deck in orange dry suits. A rescue swimmer went over the side, swam to my position with strong, steady strokes. She grabbed my BCD, said something I didn't quite catch over the engine noise and the waves. Young, dark eyes behind her mask, focused and calm. Willow, that was her name. I learned it later, but in that moment, she was just the person keeping me afloat, keeping me from slipping back under. They got a line on me, hauled me to the cutter, multiple hands reaching down to pull me onto the deck. I tried to help, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Just dead weight, just cargo. Someone stripped my mask off, started checking vitals. I was still shaking, couldn't stop. My whole body convulsing with cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The teeth, I said. My voice came out wrong, slurred. The spiral. You have to document. Willow leaned over me. Her face was professionally neutral, but I saw something else underneath. Concern, maybe alarm. Stay calm. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name? Andy. Andy Jimenez, research vessel prospect, the whales. They went silent because of the teeth, the spiral. It's a feeding ground. Been there for, I couldn't remember how long. Couldn't hold the thought. Everything kept slipping away, fragmenting into pieces that wouldn't fit together right. The pattern, I said. The skulls in a pattern. And the pale thing watching, patient. It knows we come back. They always come back to the feeding ground. More hands on me. Someone wrapping thermal blankets. Someone else checking my pupils with a light that felt like knives. I kept talking, couldn't stop. The data needed documentation. The observations needed recording. That was the job. That was always the job. Teeth in a spiral. Perfect mathematical spiral. The whales knew. That's why they went silent. They knew what was down there, what's been down there, what's always been. The world tilted. Or maybe I tilted. Hard to tell. Everything was going soft at the edges, blurring together. I saw Willow writing something on a clipboard. Saw her mouth moving, talking to someone else on the deck. Saw her glance back at me with that same professional concern. Later, days later, when my core temperature was back to normal and I could think straight again, I saw her report. She documented everything. The rescue, the hypothermia, the incoherent state. And in the notes section, in her neat, precise handwriting, subject babbling about teeth and spirals, possible nitrogen narcosis or hypothermia-induced confusion, recommends psychiatric evaluation. But in that moment, lying on the cutter's deck wrapped in thermal blankets and still shaking with cold that went deeper than flesh, all I could do was keep talking, keep trying to make them understand what I'd seen in the dark below. What was still down there, watching, waiting, patient as the deep itself. The dive computer sat on Betty's desk between us. Small black device, scratched case, digital display blank now that I'd powered it down. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, set it back down. 7 minutes, she said. I nodded, didn't trust my voice yet. At 530 feet. Another nod, Betty leaned back in her chair. The office was warm. Too warm after the cold of the medical bay, after the bone-deep chill that still hadn't left my body. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Through the window behind her, I could see the harbour, the prospect tide at the dock, grey water rolling under grey sky. Andy. She folded her hands on the desk. You understand what this means? I understood. 530 feet on compressed air. That was nitrogen narcosis territory. Rapture of the deep, the old divers called it. Drunk on nitrogen. Judgment gone. Decision-making shot to hell. People died at that depth. Made stupid choices. Forgot to check their gauges. Breathed themselves into unconsciousness and never woke up. 7 minutes was impossible. The computer malfunctioned, I said. My voice came out rough, salt-damaged. Depth sensor failed. Did it? Not a question. I met her eyes. Betty had been running the institute for 15 years. Seen every kind of equipment failure, every type of diver error, every excuse and explanation. She knew when someone was lying. I was lying. The data's corrupted. I tried again. Pressure differential must have. The medical exam came back. She tapped a folder on her desk. No signs of decompression sickness, no joint pain, no neurological symptoms, no evidence of nitrogen buildup. You came up from 500 feet in under 3 minutes and you're fine. Fine. The word hung there between us. That's not possible, I said. No, it's not. The heater kicked on, rattling in the corner. I stared at the dive computer. 7 minutes of bottom time at a depth that should have killed me. The numbers didn't lie. Couldn't lie. Not when they were recorded digitally, time-stamped, locked into memory. I'd gone down to 430 feet. Stayed there, hovering above that spiral of skulls. Then the current had grabbed me, dragged me deeper, and I'd looked down into the abyss and seen. My hand started shaking. Betty saw it, pushed a mug of coffee across the desk toward me. I wrapped both palms around it, felt the heat, watched the surface tremble. Tell me what happened down there. I couldn't, wouldn't. The words were there. Creature, pale flesh, black eyes, ancient hunger. But they stayed locked behind my teeth. Soon as I said them out loud, soon as I tried to make someone else understand, I'd cross a line. Become the crazy diver who saw monsters. Lost my credibility, my career. Everything I'd built over 3 years of careful observation and methodical documentation. Equipment failure, I said. Current was stronger than expected. I got disoriented. Betty watched me for a long moment. Then she opened the folder, pulled out a single sheet, slid it resignation form. You're grounded, she said. Medical review pending. Could be 6 months, could be permanent, depending on what the board decides. She paused. Or you can sign that now. Walk away clean. I stared at the paper. Standard Institute letterhead. Blank spaces for name and date. Signature line at bodice, I said. 3 years of acoustic monitoring, the whale populations, the migration patterns. I know, her voice was gentle, almost kind. And we'll continue the work, but not with you. Not after this. Not after I'd violated every safety protocol. Not after I'd done a solo dive to depth without proper support, without backup, without authorization. Not after the computer showed 7 minutes at 530 feet and I walked away without a scratch. I picked up the pen. My hand moved across the paper. Name, date, signature, muscle memory, same as logging data or checking equipment. When it was done, I set the pen down and pushed the form back across the desk. The monitoring station, I said. The hydrophones. We'll send someone else. Another researcher. Another set of eyes and ears. Someone who'd review my data, check my methodology, maybe even continue the acoustic surveys. Someone who hadn't seen what waited in the deep. I stood up. Legs felt weak, unsteady. The office tilted slightly, then righted itself. The dive computer, Betty said. Leave it here. I looked at the small black device. 7 minutes of impossible data locked in its memory. Proof that I'd gone too deep and stayed too long and somehow survived. Proof that the laws of physics and physiology had bent around me down there in the dark. Proof of nothing if no one believed it. I left it on her desk and walked out. 3 weeks later, I crossed the Idaho border. Landlocked, 800 miles from the nearest ocean, mountains on every horizon, air so dry it made my nose bleed for the first week. I found work at a university in Boise. Data analysis, nothing glamorous. They needed someone who could process large datasets, run statistical models, turn raw numbers into coherent reports. Didn't matter that my experience was marine biology. Numbers were numbers, the apartment was small. Third floor of a converted house, single bedroom, kitchenette barely big enough to turn around in, window faced east, morning sun coming through thin curtains. No ocean sounds, no wave slap against hull, no creak of anchor chain, no wind screaming through rigging, just traffic noise and bird calls and the neighbor's dog barking at 6 every morning. I unpacked the essentials first. Clothes, coffee maker, laptop. The rest could wait. Most of it I'd left behind anyway. Cold weather gear, dive equipment, 3 years of accumulated shipboard life. Sold what I could, donated the rest. Didn't need waterproof notebooks in Idaho. Didn't need thermal layers rated for Aleutian winters. Didn't need any reminders of what I'd left behind in those depths. But the laptop, that I kept. First night in the new place, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and opened the public databases. NOAA maintained real-time marine mammal tracking. Population surveys updated quarterly. Migration data collected from dozens of research stations along the Aleutian chain. All publicly accessible, all free to anyone who knew where to look. I pulled up the acoustic monitoring grid. 47 stations, each one represented by a small blue dot on the map. Found the coordinates for my old territory. The 173 degrees west. Grid square 77 delta. Population estimate 42 humpback whales. Down from 51 when I'd left. Down from 68 when I'd first noticed the pattern. I bookmarked the page. Year 1 in Boise, the count dropped to 37. Year 2, it hit 29. Year 3, 22 whales remained in grid square 77 delta. I checked the database every week, sometimes more often, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and the silence pressed too close. The numbers updated quarterly. But I watched anyway. Watched the blue dot on the map, the population estimate ticking downward, the migration pattern shifting as whales abandoned that stretch of water. They knew. Somewhere in their ancient evolutionary memory, they understood what waited there, understood to stay away, to find other feeding grounds, to pass that knowledge to their calves through songs that crossed ocean basins. Stay away from the deep trench. Stay away from the spiraling dark. Stay away from the thing that arranges bones on the seafloor. But there were always stragglers. Always a few whales who wandered into that grid square, who dove too deep or sang too long or stayed too late in the season. The numbers never hit zero, just kept declining, slow and steady, year after year. Methodical, patient. I sat in my apartment and watched the data update and understood what I was seeing. Not random predation, not natural population fluctuation. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something feeding point 5 years gone now. 5 years since I'd felt salt water on my skin or heard the ocean's voice. 5 years since I'd looked down into the abyss and seen what looked back. The university job was fine. Steady paycheck, decent benefits, colleagues who didn't ask too many questions about where I'd worked before or why I'd left. I analyzed climate data mostly. Temperature trends, precipitation models, snowpack measurements from mountain weather stations. Nothing that touched the ocean. Nothing that made me remember except the database. Except the weekly checks, the quarterly updates, the slow inevitable decline of whale populations in grid square 77 delta. 18 whales now. 18 and dropping. I'd tried to warn people. Those first few months after I'd resigned, I'd sent emails, contacted marine biologists, reached out to other researchers, wrote careful messages explaining the population decline and the acoustic anomalies and the need for further investigation. Never mentioned what I'd seen. Never talked about pale flesh or black eyes or the terrible patient hunger. Just presented the data, let the numbers speak for themselves. No one responded. Or they did, briefly, with polite thanks and vague promises to look into it. Then nothing. The data wasn't compelling enough, wasn't urgent enough. Whale populations fluctuated, migration patterns shifted. These things happened. I stopped sending emails, stopped trying to make people understand something I barely understood myself, the thing in the deep. I'd thought about it every day for 5 years, tried to rationalize it, categorize it, fit it into some framework that made sense. Maybe a giant squid grown larger than any recorded specimen. Maybe some deep-sea species not yet documented, something that had evolved in the trenches and rarely surfaced. Maybe I'd been nitrogen drunk after all, hallucinating in the narcosis, seeing monsters that didn't exist, but the dive computer didn't lie, 7 minutes at 530 feet. And I'd survived. Not because I was skilled or lucky or careful. I'd survived because the creature hadn't been hungry enough to bother with something so small. I was barely a mouthful, barely worth the effort. It had looked at me with those black eyes and dismissed me, turned back to the dark, returned to its patient waiting. Whales, though. Whales were worth the effort. 40 tons of meat and blubber descending into the feeding zone every season, singing their location for anyone, anything, to hear. Easy prey. I sat at my desk in the apartment and pulled up the database again. Saturday night, rain drumming against the window, streetlights casting yellow pools on wet pavement. The map loaded slowly, blue dots appearing one by one across the Aleutian chain. Grid square 77 delta, Population estimate 18, down 2 from last quarter. I closed the laptop. Outside, traffic hissed past on wet streets. A siren wailed somewhere distant. The neighbor's dog started barking, stopped, started again. Normal sounds, human sounds, the sounds of a world that had nothing to do with the deep ocean or the things that live there. But I knew what waited in those depths. Patient and hungry and ancient beyond measure. Knew it was still there, still feeding, still arranging its kills in spirals that no human eye would ever see. Knew the whale populations would keep declining, slow and steady, until maybe one day they learned to avoid that grid square entirely. Or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe some instinct would always draw them back. Some evolutionary imperative stronger than fear. I lived with this knowledge every day, woke up with it, went to sleep with it, carried it through every mundane moment of my landlocked life, knew what lurked beneath the waves, knew that no one would believe me if I told them, knew the ancient thing in the Aleutian depths would continue its methodical feeding season after season, year after year, arranging bones on the seafloor in patterns that meant something to its incomprehensible mind. The rain kept falling. I sat in the dark and listened to it hit the window and thought about cold grey water and the terrible patience of things that live where sunlight never reaches. Thought about spirals of whale skulls on the deep ocean floor. Thought about black eyes in pale flesh, watching, always waiting, always hungry.